Good afternoon, everybody. A little after 2:06 p.m. here at K-Talk Radio. Delighted to be with you this afternoon. Dale Williams sitting in for Mark Maxon. We may have achieved the only time on the radio when there has been a segue between a Screaming Mimi from the Beatles and the Byrds, probably the Byrds' greatest single hit from the 1960s. So I want to pat myself on the back for that piece of artistic expression here on the radio this afternoon. I am delighted to be with you. Sometimes we have a little bit of stage fright coming back, having not spoken with you for so long, and that's a good thing. If we get totally unafraid of the radio, then maybe it'll be like a gun and we'll misuse it, right? We're going to have a call-in show today, and that's not going to happen instantly. But let me just tell you the numbers ahead of time, because I know some of you are going to want to talk to the gentleman we have as a guest here. And what a surprise and what a privilege it is to have Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from the Idaho State University on today. We'll get to him in just a moment, but the phone number is 254-5855. Down in Utah County, that would be 470-5855. Up north, Weber, North Davis County, up where the F-16s fly around above you, 670-5855. Now, there's another item. Let's not forget the streaming audio, and let's hope and pray that everything is working well with that today, because the notice of Dr. Meldrum's presence here on the radio in Salt Lake City made the circuit on the Internet last night, and so there'll be a lot of people out of state who want to listen to this discussion we're going to have. That would be available through www.k-talk.com. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. He is an associate professor of anatomy and anthropology, an adjunct associate professor of the Department of Anthropology, Department of Occupational and Physical Therapy for the Idaho State University, and he is the affiliate curator for the Idaho Museum of Natural History. And we're going to take a little cue from Wikipedia as well as the Idaho State University website now. Dr. Meldrum received his Bachelor of Science in Zoology, specializing in vertebrate locomotion at Brigham Young University in 1982, his Master of Science degree at Brigham Young University in 1984, and a PhD in anatomical sciences. That's not the first Latin word that I'm going to mess up this afternoon, with an emphasis in biological anthropology from State University of New York at Stony Brook. Did I say a PhD? And that was in 1989. He held the position of postdoctoral visiting assistant professor at Duke University Medical Center from 1989 to 1991. Meldrum worked at Northwestern University's Department of Cell, Molecular, and Structural Biology for a short while in 1993 before joining the faculty of Idaho State University, where he currently teaches. Dr. Meldrum's research revolves around questions of vertebrate evolutionary morphology, especially primate locomotor adaptations. His formal study of primates began with doctoral research on terrestrial adaptations in African primates, and has since taken him from the dusty skeletal cabinets of far-flung museums to the remote badlands of Colombia and Argentina in search of fossil New World primates. He has published extensively on the evolutionary history of South American primates and has described several new extinct species. He has documented varied primate locomotor specializations in laboratory and semi-natural settings. More recently, his attention has returned to the emergence of modern human bipedalism. And just to give you a sense of who we have on the line waiting for us here, a little scholarly endorsement, quote, Jeff Meldrum is a scientist and expert in human locomotor adaptations in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, and that's the book we're going to discuss today. He examines all evidence critically, not to force a conclusion, but to establish a baseline of facts upon which further research can depend. His science is not submerged by opinion and dogmatic assumption. With objectivity and insight, he analyzes evidence from tracks, skin ridges on the soles of feet, film footage, and DNA, and he compares it to that on primates and various other species. He disentangles fact from anecdote, supposition, and wishful thinking, and concludes that the search for Yeti and Sasquatch is a valid scientific endeavor. By offering a critical scrutiny, Sasquatch does more for this field of investigation than all the past documents and polemics of contesting experts. That's Dr. George Schaller, Vice President of the Wildlife Conservation. Without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. How's our connection, Dr. Meldrum?
Loud and clear. Thanks very much.
I am delighted on such short notice that you could be with us today. In essence, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Meldrum broke and you correct me, Dr. Meldrum, if I have this a little bit wrong, but there was a kind of threshold where the issue of Bigfoot or Sasquatch was not examined by a true heavyweight sort of scholarly approach in a hardcover book and all the rest of it. You've stepped out of the milieu of scholarship that had been rather disdainful of that subject, and when you jumped out with both feet, did you not?
Well, to an extent. I'd like to think that I've extended the effort of those who've gone before me, and we certainly need to acknowledge, the pioneering efforts of people like Grover Krantz and John Bindernagel and John Napier went out on a limb early on, Ivan Sanderson. There were a number of people who have taken this issue by the horns and have wrestled with it. I found that the reception to my book has been very gratifying and positive, and it has helped to open doors, and it has helped to create opportunities for dialogue with other scholars, and to that end, I'm very pleased.
Well, let's go back to the experience you had. I would sort of call it an epiphany. You were not particularly a Bigfoot believer or an ardent follower of stories about Bigfoot, I suppose, but you had an episode in Walla Walla, Washington, that really turned your life around in this area, did it not?
Well, in a way, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and so as such was aware of and very intrigued as a young boy by the prospect, the thought of such an animal existing. But that interest, as with many youthful preoccupations, kind of waxed and waned as things happened and as different experiences and life's events took place. But on that day in Walla Walla, yes, this experience of actually seeing very, very fresh footprints right under your nose, so to speak, that was a very impactful event, and it sort of set me back because being confronted with this and having the academic training that I have in this area and the experiences with human and non-human primate footprints and locomotion and so on, I mean, these footprints had a significant impact on me, and it was clear to my mind that these were, there was no misidentification here. These were either the footprints of an unrecognized animal, or this was a very intriguing hoax. A
very elaborate hoax. Maybe we should back up. You were called to that scene by a Mr. Peterson, yes?
Freeman, Paul Freeman.
Freeman.
I was paying a surprise visit to Paul Freeman and other residents of Walla Walla who were featured in a little book by Vance Orchard, a journalist in that area. And it was an unannounced visit, and he, it seemed rather serendipitously, had found some footprints that very morning and offered to take us out and show us.
Well, I listened to a little video of you discussing this with, I want to say it was Linda Moulton Howe. I can't really remember who the interviewer was, but I'll never forget the moment that you described as you followed these tracks, I believe alongside a rural road,
right.
And when they appeared to be of a casual nature, just striding almost the stride of a man, but then they took about a right-angle turn, and certain things happened in terms of the depressions. The tracks themselves that told you, who are, you are the expert in human locomotion, that this thing just about had to be real.
Well, right. I mean, these weren't just kind of haphazardly or too uniformly disposed footprints. I mean, the pattern suggested real behaviors that made sense in the context in which we found them, and something had clearly spooked this individual, and that something was probably a car coming down this very rural road on a weekend night or early in the wee hours of the morning. and its direction of travel, as you said, changed abruptly, and its speed picked up immensely. Its stride doubled in length nearly, and the footprints also showed the dynamics of a running gait instead of a walking stride. And those, again, yes, those had a tremendous impact on me, because this wasn't just a series of rubber stamp type of imprints. These were very dynamic imprints that showed variation according to the context and the interaction with the substrate. When it was wet and slippery, this thing slipped and the toes dug in and curled, flexed strongly to gain a grip. That type of feature that really attested to this being an animate foot as opposed to the result, the product of some contrivance with a prosthetic or an artificial foot.
Well, and we might want to mention, without getting too far over the heads of us lay people, that this foot was exhibiting, this did not look like Shaq's or,
right.
Wilt Chamberlain's footprint or something. This thing exhibited some clearly non-human, more ape-related mechanics, yes? Right.
And that's what probably impressed me more than anything, is that I was very familiar that chimpanzees, for example, have, and I've studied and filmed and documented chimpanzee feet and footprints as they walk. They exhibit what's called a mid-tarsal break, and all that means is that the foot has a greater degree of flexibility through the instep, where we have a rather stiff arch that allows our foot to act like a more efficient lever. The chimpanzee foot, which is adapted more for climbing, has this flexible instep, which permits its toes to remain somewhat long.
And you've spent a good part of your life, have you not, investigating, researching, doing field work, trying to trace the lineage of that change in the hominid to the modern human foot, which is an elegant and very speedy kind of a structure. That's your thing, is to figure out when you see a fossil or a fossil footprint, to see where that individual that left that footprint is on the progression towards the modern foot. So, we're not talking about somebody who just is out in the woods scratching their head and saying, this looks like an ape here, right?
Well, right. My doctoral work was specifically on these types of terrestrial adaptations, and then I had various dalliances with other things that caught my attention. But then more recently, and in part because of this interaction with these footprints, my attention has turned back to this issue of how the distinctively human type of a foot has evolved. And we shouldn't necessarily look at the Sasquatch morphology as a transitional morphology on its way to a human form, but this is a distinct adaptation that shows some primitive characteristics that have similarities to chimpanzees, but it also has some highly derived features in its own right.
It sounds like it's out on a branch, another branch of the tree. Dr. Meldrum, we're right up against a commercial break. That'll give you an opportunity to take a sip of water and collect yourself a little bit. I'll do a few chores here in the studio, and we'll get back. I'm not done pursuing this this seminal incident in Dr. Meldrum's life having to do with the tracks in the soft dirt. Stay with us.
Barbara Jean, you're not alone. L2K, weekday afternoons, 5 to 7 on K-Talk.
Okay, everybody can get their jaw off the floor this afternoon. It's true, we have not just a Bigfoot show going here, but we have the mother of all Bigfoot shows. We have the great privilege of having Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum with us this afternoon. And we will give you an opportunity to talk to Dr. Meldrum shortly. Those numbers, the number, for most of you under the sound of my voice is 254-5855. We're talking about an experience back in 1996 where Dr. Meldrum went out and took a look at some tracks that were alongside a rural road. And with his keen eye and the vast amount of experience and training he had, of course, he knew he was looking at something extraordinary. Where did those tracks stop, Dr. Meldrum? Do you remember?
Well, we lost them as they went into an irrigation ditch, a brush-lined, gravelly irrigation ditch, where the soil wasn't as amenable to tracking there. But they had clearly come around this through this cultivated land, which is right in the foothills, just shy of the forest, probably attracted by abandoned fruit orchards. There are plum and apple orchards scattered about there. And then apparently were intending to head up the ridge line back into the forest when, as I said, a vehicle probably came down. And so you can imagine just kind of making a hairpin turn in the light of these oncoming headlights, and then hustling back towards the only cover which was available, which was this brush-lined irrigation ditch.
And has your experience since that day suggested that these creatures are, I'm a little reluctant to call them animals, actually, because of what I know about the the close contact that people have had and the human quality they exhibit, but whatever. They're pretty nocturnal, are they not?
They seem to be, yes. I don't think behaviors and activity during the daytime is completely precluded. I mean, there are certainly reports in the daylight, but there is an inordinate number of reports and activity that come during the nighttime. So it seems that would be their preferred, and that would make sense in order to avoid or minimize human contact. Activities at night would be the sensible thing, a sensible approach.
Well, so what happened in your life subsequent to this? How did you change course, and what was the sequence immediately following this experience?
Well, I mean, immediately following was this long drive back to my hometown of Boise, where my extended family lives. And this is a 5-hour plus drive, contemplating these casts that we have made. My brother was with me on this trip, and just reflecting on what was the likelihood that this fellow or someone else could have pulled off a hoax that was so amazingly impressive. And upon arriving at home in the wee hours of the morning, my brother went off to his room, and I was huddled over these casts wrapped in newspaper, carefully unwrapping them and washing away the soil and laying them out on the garage floor to examine. And just that realization beginning to kind of set in that these tracks they look so anatomically convincing, so realistic, that it just kind of came down on me that I needed to pursue this question further. There was something to this that needed that was deserving of some real serious attention. And it went on from there. I mean, I sort of resolved at that point that despite or in addition to, not despite, but in addition to the many insights and conclusions that have been drawn by Grover Krantz, who probably did the most thorough examination of footprints previously, I felt like there was still something to be done, and so I set about to try to assemble as many examples of footprints as I could lay my hands on to get a sense of the range of variation, and particularly, though, to look for the consistencies, if there were any. Were there examples of repeat appearance of individuals? Were there consistent features and characteristics that were distinct and distinguished this adaptation of a very large, heavy bipedal primate from that of a human?
Certainly, as would be in keeping with your training, you essentially sounds like you're laying out an approach to apply the scientific method to future finds,
exactly.
Future evidence. Yeah.
Exactly.
This individual, I'm curious, did this rank as a heavyweight among footprints, or the size of the individual suggested by the footprint? Was it maybe more of a female or smaller, or how would you characterize that original set of castings?
Well, I suspect that this one was probably a female, based on the slenderness of the track, the gracile nature of its track, the track for its length. It was just under 15 inches, about 14 and a half inches in length, and about
foot, though.
Well, yes. I mean, if this were just somebody taking off their boots and marching through the mud on a lark, it would be, a foot that's 14 and a half inches long. We're up in about 0.1% of the population.
There's our break again, Dr. Meldrum. having a visit with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. If you want to call and start queuing up for questions, feel free to do so at 254-5855. And we're right back at you. It's coming down to the bottom of the hour. It's almost 12:30, about 30 seconds, 12:30 p.m. in the Great Salt Lake Valley. We're getting back to Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, who we have from Idaho State University. But first, another little endorsement, just a minor endorsement here. This is from Dr. Jane Goodall. Quote, Jeffrey Meldrum's book, Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, brings a much-needed level of scientific analysis to the Sasquatch or Bigfoot debate, unquote. Well, so you have some peers that are not ridiculing you, Dr. Meldrum, and we can talk a little bit more about the culture of academia and how, fraught with pitfalls an undertaking like this is inherently. But before we do that, give us a sketch, if you would. You had this real wake-up call. You had a lot of time to examine these castings. Did you then start to orient your professional undertakings, your work, so that it would focus more and more on this? Give us a sense of how things progressed after that.
Well, it became a significant but not all-encompassing facet of my research program. I mean, this, from my perspective, this was a fascinating natural experiment where we potentially had a parallel evolution of bipedalism, an organism that had evolved the habit of walking on its hind legs independently of the human lineage, and potentially in some interestingly contrasting ways that would be particularly adapted to the environment in which this animal found itself. And so, for example, the mid-tarsal break, there probably were only a handful of anthropologists who could explain what that term actually refers to. It's known in the literature, but it had never really been talked about a lot. And so I decided to take a closer look at that and to see if we could, with more modern techniques of observation and documentation, and look at the kinematics, the movements of those portions of the chimpanzee and other non-human ape feet. This casts some interesting new light on the interpretation of early hominid bipedalism, because as I re-examined some of for example, the fossil footprints from Laetoli, East Africa, attributed to early Australopithecines of some 3.5 million years ago, there were features that, to my eye, were remarkably similar to some of the interesting dynamic features that were apparent in the Sasquatch tracks, the purported Sasquatch tracks.
Maybe we should give a layperson's quick sketch or a sketch oriented toward the lay person when you talk about this ridge, this pressure line that it forms.
Exactly.
It's not the human foot, which has essentially a sort of a hollow space on the inside, a cavity, and bears on the outside on a ridge. It isn't that elegant L-shaped mechanism. This thing is more of a trudging. Well, explain it to us.
Well, it's basically, I mean, instead of having the foot stiffen, so you have this more efficient leverage and speed adaptations for running, for example, the foot has a much more prehensile capability, a grasping capability, and so by maintaining this flexibility in the instep, the push-off from the step comes from the entire forefoot rather than being concentrated at the end of that stiff lever, which in the human is the ball of the foot and the big toe.
Yes.
And so by having the push-off, which helps to accommodate this large, massive body mass, having it distributed over a larger area, these toes can remain longer, which then means that foot can grasp onto the very irregular surfaces that one finds in mountainsides and forested montane environments in a very efficient way. So it's an interesting compromise between giving up the divergence of the big toe and its prehensile ability, which is an arboreal adaptation for climbing in trees, giving that up, but yet retaining some of the flexibility and mobility of the foot in order to retain the grasping ability that allows it to climb and to maneuver through this irregular terrestrial environment in a way very much more efficient than a human can navigate this terrain.
Right, except that breaking into a long stride run is something that maybe a creature of this kind would be able to imitate at best, it sounds like.
Right. They're not going to be running marathons.
And now this brings us to an interesting aspect of probably the crown jewel in Bigfoot lore, which is the 1967 Patterson film, because sure enough, the some would say critter moving away from the camera in that black and white film is walking pretty much it's just along the lines of the thing you're describing, is it not?
Exactly, and that's why that's such a fascinating case, is because not only do the footprints, which were very well documented at that site by several different investigators, exhibit the same characteristics and features, but in addition, the film subject exhibits the very aspects of the anatomy and the kinematics of the foot and ankle and leg and so forth, which correlate with those features of the footprints. So it's really a fascinating. I mean, just on the basis of the tracks and the correlated anatomy, I think there's a very, very strong case that this is an authentic piece of film footage.
Why has the water been muddied so much, Dr. Meldrum, about that film? There's reports that one of the persons involved that day made a deathbed confession about it being a phony sort of thing. What's the story about that?
Well, there's yes, the deathbed confession story is highly exaggerated. Patterson himself, who took the film, who did die of leukemia some years ago, never recanted on the experience that he had. Bob Gimlin, his partner there at the scene, is alive today and to this day stands by his testimony of what transpired and what they witnessed. And he actually had a much better view because his line of sight wasn't obscured by the viewfinder of a camera up to his eye. There have been a number of pretenders who have laid claim to being the man in the fur suit. The most recent was Bob Hieronymus, who got a great deal of attention. And yet, with every retelling, his story was modified, and there were numerous inconsistencies, and he simply, quite bluntly, doesn't fit the costume. He does, or the suit, the so-called suit.
I'll tell you what, whatever human being was in that thing, it must have been a well-padded suit. Here we come up to another break, Dr. Meldrum, for a couple minutes, a commercial break. When you see the Patterson film and some of the other, there are probably two other decent videos of what appear to be the same kind of creature. I'll tell you, Shaquille O'Neal has nothing on these creatures. Haystacks Calhoun, maybe. Andre the Giant, no, they none of them come close. We're talking massive upper bodies. And folks, you live in an area, northern Utah particularly, northeastern Utah if I recall, where these creatures have been sighted rather frequently by some pretty reputable people. Let's talk more about it when we come back. If you've just gotten out on your lunch break this afternoon, welcome back to the radio. Welcome to K-Talk, the great AM 630, one of the oldest, almost the oldest talk radio formatted radio stations in the United States. My name is Dale Williams. I'm delighted to be with you here today. Don't forget, you can still tell folks out of state and out of range of our rather large electronic footprint that the program can be heard on the internet at k-talk.com. Streaming audio, just press the listen button and away you go. I'm sitting in for Mark Maxon today. I'm just tickled to death to have Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum of Idaho State University with us. He is a world authority on human locomotion, on locomotor adaptation, which in my layperson's mind basically means the path, the evolutionary path of earlier hominids, as they changed, the way they walked, the biomechanics that were most efficient for their life and times through the ages. Dr. Meldrum is an expert on that, on how to figure out the anatomy of creatures based on fossil record and how they changed and evolved, and how this wonderful foot that we walk on today, which makes us so fleet, eventually came to be. But your experience, Dr. Meldrum, is suggests that we're not talking about Gigantopithecus or something here when we're talking about Bigfoot. We're talking about somebody or something that just sort of got off on a different branch of the tree way back.
Well, actually, my null hypothesis, my jumping off point is that we probably are dealing with something very akin to Gigantopithecus.
Okay.
I'm one who sees in the anatomies and in the behaviors very similar corollaries to what we have observed and learned about the natural history of the great apes, as opposed to the hominids, the early human ancestors. Largely because, unless this is a very, very early offshoot of that radiation, with the earliest appearance of Homo, we have an accompanying archaeological record. We have material culture. We have stone tools and other artifacts that become increasingly sophisticated as we get nearer and nearer to modern humans, and as well as associated behaviors. And all of those things seem to be, at least to my sphere of experience, seem to be absent in dealing with Sasquatch. Instead, we have a great ape that is remarkably superficially similar to us, more similar than a chimpanzee or gorilla, than in its posture and mode of locomotion. And the thing I always try to bring to people's minds when they point to characteristics or to certain behaviors which they feel lend this animal, this creature, this being, whatever you want to refer to it as, more humanity than it is maybe justified, to reflect on their experiences if they've had any, and that's kind of the critical thing, up close and personal with any of the great apes, be it on a documentary, on your television in the living room in the evening, or spending time at a zoo watching these animals and how they interact with one another and with the human onlookers. Just a case in point, there was a discussion along these lines that took place at one time, and one investigator cited an eyewitness who claimed that they saw the Sasquatch turn and grin at them. And on the basis of that grin, which he equated with human facial expression, he concluded that the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, must be much more human than animal.
Well, anyone who spent time around orangutans
exactly.
would have had the same experiences.
Well, exactly, and that's just it. I think depending on our experiences, if your extent with animal life was limited to a cow and a horse and a pet dog, then seeing an animal such as this that bears such a remarkable resemblance to us would be quite a shocking experience. And that's, in fact, the very experience that, for example, Victorian English people experienced when the first great apes were set before them. It was this uncanny resemblance to humans. What role could they possibly play in the grand scheme of things?
And that would have been lowland gorillas and chimpanzees, and
exactly.
And only much later in history did we actually validate the claims that there was such a thing as a highland gorilla. Is that right?
That's right. The mountain gorilla was very recent.
Was it in the 20th century that they?
Yeah,
so
exactly. In the early 1900s.
Now think about that, ladies and gentlemen. You have a pretty well populated continent, lots of Europeans running around by the 20th century on the continent of Africa, and yet confirmation of this rumor or myth of this great big high altitude sort of dwelling gorilla was only in the 20th century. Let's talk to, and I have a ton of other questions. We're going to weave them through here for Dr. Meldrum, but we've got a few people waiting, and I promised to bring you on, so let's give it a try. Utah County, we have Robert. Hi, Robert.
Yeah, just, well, first, in terms of eyewitness accounts, if the doctor is familiar with the work of Elizabeth Loftus, I think you know how unreliable those can be, correct?
I'm sorry, our connection's not really good. It was kind of cutting out. If I'm
familiar with the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who does work on eyewitness accounts.
Oh, yes, I have heard of her work, yes.
Yeah, and so that shows you that eyewitness accounts are probably the least reliable. But I keep wondering that why there's no physical evidence, no bones, no bodies, no pelts that anybody's ever found in terms of...
Right. Well, first I would point out that while certainly there are limitations and there are qualifications that should be borne in mind when dealing with eyewitness testimony, the nature of the testimony, the nature of the experience has to also be taken into account as well. And when you have experienced outdoorsmen, when you have park rangers, when you have foresters and so forth that have daylight experiences, sometimes at very close quarters, that's different than someone, say, at a police lineup with 5 people who look like they could all be related to one another and trying to pick out which one grabbed her purse in a dark alley.
Okay, well, so you haven't read Loftus's work.
Pardon?
Then you haven't read Loftus's work, because that's exactly what she says. She would disagree with you.
Then I disagree with that work, then.
Well, that's her specialty.
Well, I realize that.
But why no bones? Why no pelts? Why no dead bodies?
Right. Well, again, that's a vexing situation, and that's obviously one of the first questions that comes to people's mind. The way I approach that, and admittedly from an apologetic point of view, is to consider 2 factors. One is the natural history of the presumed natural history of the organism, and 2, the physical environment in which it's found. If this isn't a great ape, and we can, just for the sake of argument, extrapolate from the natural history of great apes, this is a long-lived individual. It is very rare in its environment.
Long life.
It develops slowly. It reproduces very infrequently. And so when a death occurs, it's going to be a very rare event. It's not like, say, the turnover in deer carcasses on an annual basis.
Or even panthers, cougars,
sure.
Black bears even.
I'm just saying, when you're extrapolating that much and have that little evidence, I think if you're a scientist, you accept the null hypothesis.
Why?
Because that's science.
If you're going
no
to...
evidence. That's the scientific method.
No, there is evidence. That's what I'm saying. In other words, you're on the basis of...
One at a time, Robert.
On the basis of negative evidence, Robert, you're then going to dismiss...
You have footprints and eyewitness. That's all you have.
All right, Robert, you're getting a little on the vociferous side. I think we got your drift. But, Dr. Meldrum, where you're coming from, I mean, I've talked to people who have watched one of these things at about 300 yards through a rifle scope. This man has had innumerable personality testing and polygraph testing as a state employee, and he's a competent individual. So between the tracks, the fur deposits of fur, and the really clear eyewitness testimony, there is a body of evidence.
Well, right. Well, and if I could follow up on that too, this is a common tactic that if I may call them ideological skeptics, those who let's just leave it at that, often use. They will set up a supposed scientific scenario. In other words, set up a null hypothesis, but then claim there's an absence of evidence, and they'll denigrate what evidence exists. In other words, they'll say, well, it takes bones or a body, and that's true. In order for a species to be recognized and identified, it does require a type specimen. But then to say that the scientific position is to throw out or reject the null hypothesis, or if, depending on what the null hypothesis, if it's a null hypothesis, there is no organism, accept the null hypothesis, by ignoring all of the other evidence. He enumerated footprints, eyewitness accounts. We have hair that defies identification.
Dr. Meldrum, I'm sorry, we're right up at a hard break again. I always have to cut our guests off at the knees that way, but we'll be right back on that very issue.
AM 630.
That was fairly painless. Let's get right back to Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from Idaho State University. Dr. Meldrum, we're in our final segment for this hour. Can you hold with us into the next hour?
Certainly.
That's wonderful. And because there's a lot more to cover. But in this 3 or 3.5 minute interval, as you tie up the loose ends of your argument, do we have time to mention the lady with the goat train and that kind of a quality of eyewitness testimony.
Well, right. That's a great example where, again, a person who has a lot of experience in the outdoors has goat packed and hiked for many, many miles throughout the state of Colorado and has a daytime experience at very close range. And, you know, I've come to know this person and count her as a close friend, and I know her ability in the outdoors. I know her powers of observation. I know her objectivity, and this changed her life.
Wasn't she an attorney?
She worked for in an attorney's office.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Why don't you give the thumbnail version of that story before we cut over before we come up to the top of the hour?
Basically, she was packing solo along the Continental Divide Trail in southern Colorado, and had left the trail, was off trail at a remote glade, and had set up camp. Was playing a musical instrument. Her goats and dogs had gotten a little bit agitated. She thought maybe there was a bear. She took the dogs into the tent to prevent them from tangling up with the bear, grabbed her pepper spray, and upon stepping out, the goats had also come up close to the tent, turned around, and there it was standing right behind her tent, less than 15 feet from her, 8-foot-tall Sasquatch. And they locked eyes and stared at one another for quite some seconds, which probably seemed like an eternity to her, before it turned and made its way off into the forest.
Yeah. Now, don't I recall that there was actually an immature individual, or perhaps a small female, in company with that enormous?
That's right. There was a second one that was standing just behind it, somewhat obscured, and she caught a glimpse of it as it peered around to see what was going on, and then it accompanied the larger one into the forest.
Now I don't know about you, Robert, and the other skeptics out there, but when you have a person who's pretty responsible and their life is pretty together, they're obviously not deranged, and they see something that is pushing 500 pounds, maybe more, 8 feet tall, almost half as broad, just this unbelievable presence 15 feet away. I mean, that constitutes some kind of evidence, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think so.
Yeah.
I do, and I do know the discussions that take place about eyewitness accounts, and of course these are not going to tip the scale ultimately in the consideration of this question, but they certainly are valuable pieces of information.
Well, let's say we have 100 individuals in the state of Utah. I'm just throwing out a hypothesis here or whatever. We probably have at least a couple thousand cougars, maybe 5,000. I don't know. We have a lot of cougars in this state, and I've never seen one. And
right.
The only persons I know who have ever actually laid eyes on one are those who hunt with dogs,
right.
For cougars. And then you have the likelihood. Well, these are not men. But they are more intelligent than the other creatures out in the forest, and they very well may have some kind of a habit or custom for covering up their dead. But even without that, it's a tiny population in all
yeah.
that.
Well, when you talk to anyone who spends a lot of time in the outdoors, be it a wildlife biologist or even be it a paleontologist who deals with fossils, they will acknowledge when considering this issue objectively and without prejudice, they will acknowledge that the lack of bones is not that surprising, and it should not in and of itself constitute a damning situation for this question. And so, again, my point is to simply to adopt that position that, well, since there's no bones, we can just blow this whole thing off and we can just ignore this mounting body of other types of evidence, be it anecdotal, be it trace, be it even physical. As I said, hair and scat that have defied identification. I mean, how is it that we have 15-plus odd samples of hair that no expert can say, well, this is some known animal? Or scat that yields
yes,
parasites.
I mean, you have sufficient DNA trace to eliminate the possibility that those hair samples are any known critter.
Well, no, not exactly. This is on the basis of physical characteristics.
Okay.
DNA has remained a somewhat elusive target.
Is that because of desiccation?
Well, it's largely due to the fact that one of the distinguishing characteristics of the Sasquatch hair is an acellular medulla. The central shaft or core, instead of having stacked cells, is void. And in hairs that are simply shed, that fall out, that don't have an active follicle growing at their root, the DNA is extracted from those stacked cells within the medulla. So the absence of those cells makes it very, very difficult to get any DNA from most hair samples that are just found under those circumstances.
Is what you're saying that under microscopic examination, the other characteristics of the hair itself are unique?
Right, a unique combination of characteristics. Mm-hmm. So the cuticle structure, the diameter, the size and shape of the pigment cells, and so forth. Those seem to be distinct and different from what is typical of other animals and humans.
Well, Dr. Meldrum, we're right at that coming up to that top of the hour break. I have the answer, though. It's a bunch of subversives from Madagascar. They've brought over some kind of new subspecies of orangutan hair. There's sort of distributing that in our north woods up here, trying to confuse us and interfere with our attempts to secure the homeland, or to sort of pull our eye off the goal of a secure life, get us upset. I don't know what it is anyway. We're having a little fun here this afternoon at the expense of some of the skeptics, I suppose. It's Dale Williams sitting in for Mark Maxon. I'll be back after the top of the hour break with our guest, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum.
AM 630 KTKK, the sound of freedom. AM 630 KTKK, Sandy, Salt Lake City. This is K-Talk.
Say you want a revolution, well, you know, we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evil.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, that's my little that's a little departure on my part. I just had to do that. That last skeptical caller was just so adamant. There's the attitude of, it's outside my paradigm. We're not. It's too extraordinary. It's an extraordinary claim. Your evidences, your facts are not sufficiently extraordinary in nature to support the claims you're making. I had to get that off my chest. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1:06 p.m. and a little change. We're here at K-Talk Radio, substituting for Mark Maxon. My name is Dale Williams. I have the privilege of interviewing and taking calls with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum this afternoon. I have a couple of vital items having to do with this subject of Sasquatch, the increasing number of eyewitness reports coming in about Bigfoot, and about this remarkable book, Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, really the groundbreaking book in the sense of a established scholar in human locomotion, Dr. Meldrum, writing a very carefully prepared book on the subject. It's a threshold that's been broken, and now hopefully the floodgates will remain open, and other scholars will feel that they're on firm enough ground to come and go into this area where there is sufficient evidence to apply the scientific method and to start to develop a model and what have you. Anyway, I have some questions about the book, about Dr. Meldrum's progress from that day in 1996 where he saw those distinct tracks and made those castings. And we want to talk a little bit about how many individuals that he has cataloged, different tracks, some more about the quality and nature of those tracks. But we have callers on hold, and I promise to get right to them. Then as those lines clear, you will be able to queue up and talk to Dr. Meldrum as well. The numbers to reach us here this afternoon on the great AM 630 K-Talk Radio are 254-5855. In Utah County, that would be 470-5855. And up north, Ogden Weber, North Davis, 670-5855. How's our connection, Dr. Meldrum?
It's still just fine, thanks.
Great. Glad to be with you today, or I'm glad you're with us, I should say. We have a first caller. You go to the top of the queue. Bill in Salt Lake City. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Dale, and you also, Dr. Meldrum.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, actually a couple quick questions. Number one, you said that those tracks were fresh, and that's what impressed you, correct?
Well, the freshness itself wasn't necessarily the most impressive, but there was no doubt that they were fresh under the conditions.
Well, my question would be, why doesn't someone, when they go to investigate fresh tracks, take a bloodhound or some bloodhounds with them and track it? Because a bloodhound can track a child that's been missing for 3 days.
Right. Well, in my situation, in that particular instance, it was in part this tug of war that was still going on in my head as to even the possibility that such a question could be entertained, the existence of such an animal. And so, quite frankly, we both had to be back. My brother and I had to be home for commitments the next morning, and we were not, at that point, at that instant, we're not convinced to the point that we...
well, how about Patterson? Did Patterson have dogs with him? Didn't he have dogs with him?
They had made arrangements that should they find something, they would call to have these dogs brought in from Canada. They arranged with John Green, is my recollection. Unfortunately, that evening it began to rain, and it rained very hard over the course of the next night. In fact, they had some real difficulties getting their vehicles and their rigs out of the canyon.
My last question is: Have you appeared on Coast to Coast?
I have once or twice.
Are you familiar with the gentleman interviewed from Arkansas that claims to have shot 2 Bigfoots?
Well, actually, I've heard his program about 3 times. He's repeated that story multiple times. These are the ones buried in the sand somewhere in Texas.
Has anyone ever bothered to dig them up?
Well, as I said, that story has been aired on Coast to Coast multiple times, each time as if it was a new event.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Meldrum. That's actually that's got to be in the Hall of Fame of Coast to Coast radio programs. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that was the incident where some pelt hunters back in the late 70s, as I recall, shot something large and bipedal, just sort of on speculation, and chased it. And of course, they ended up shooting a couple of them. But pretty convincing dialogue. That old boy. The description of confronting these things in that brushy area near that river down in Arkansas.
Right. Well, exactly. And then there's all the dickering about who gets the map and this, that, and the other. And right. The last time I heard it, I was actually out in the field, and my field partner, who does listen to Coast fairly regularly at night, came and woke me up and said, "You've got to listen to this." And I said, "Well, I've heard that story. It was a couple of years ago. We've listened to the whole thing then, so it's been repeated several times." Yeah,
you can't beat it for late night radio fare. It's a classic.
Exactly.
Okay, John, you're on the air with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum.
Doctor, excellent program and great information you got there. I just wanted to make a comment about the caller that was more than skeptical about the evidence and mentioned about eyewitness accounts and the unreliability of that.
Right.
While it's true that there is unreliability between witnesses as to certain details about what a particular person might have looked like who committed a particular crime, there's no question in the minds of those eyewitnesses that it was committed by a human being versus, say, a dog or a cat or anything like that. And so it's a completely spurious argument to suggest that the unreliability of witnesses with respect to identifying a potential Sasquatch or Bigfoot versus, say, a brown bear or something of that nature out in the wild that they might also be familiar with.
Well, right. I mean, unless we're dealing with some less than ideal conditions where, you see a dark shape in the night, or you see a flash of brown fur, and your imagination gets the better of you. I mean, I'm sure I can recognize that, and I've dealt with multiple reports of footprints, for example. I've learned not to take someone's word at their description of a footprint, because very frequently when I do finally see a photograph, it's a pothole, it's a bear, it's just not what they originally described to me, and that same kind of caution and conservatism should be applied to eyewitness accounts, most definitely. But on the other hand, when you have these constantly repeated, ongoing reports by very sophisticated witnesses, it's hard to just simply dismiss it. But I didn't mean to interrupt you.
How many unique individuals do you have footprint castings for, Dr. Meldrum?
Well, I've not ever really broken it down quite like that, but multiple. What's more interesting to me is when you have an individual in a given geographical area that over the course of 10, 20, even 30 years has left footprints which are recognizably left by the same individual, not a rubber stamped duplicate clone of another track, but yet oftentimes with subtle differences in depending on the circumstances and the nature of the substrate and so forth. In fact, there have been some instances where I have recognized amongst casts that someone has accumulated the same individuals, and actually, and it's quite clear to my eye that they are the same individual, but because of the difference in the splay of toes or the degree of impression or what else, they don't look exactly like one another, and I've had to actually point out, look at this detail, look at this detail, look at this crease across the big toe.
They're incurring injuries out running around out in the environment they're in, and so there's some changes, I would think, in the pad of the foot.
Well, there certainly could be, as well as growth. Individuals, young adults and juveniles that are growing and increasing in size and breadth, absolutely.
Boy, that's a heck of a ruse if somebody's putting that sort of thing on. John, do you have any other questions for our guest today?
Not at this time, but thank you very much for having me on.
All right, thanks for being such a polite and civil caller. Okay. Now, folks, if you want to call up and you're skeptical and you want to, engage in a little polemics, I don't want to discourage you from that. It's fine. But we had a caller last hour that talked over the guest a little bit, and so I get a little bit defensive that way. But that's not to discourage. That's not meant to discourage challenging phone calls. Bob in Idaho, what's your question today?
Hi, Dale. Yeah. Well, I think we're all skeptical, but without the corpus delicti. But I wondered a couple questions. Were there any genes that were unrecognizable in any of the hair samples?
Well, as I said, getting DNA has been a challenge. The best results that we've had so far were from a hair sample that came from Ontario, and it's still in the preliminary stages of the study, but they have sequenced a length of the mitochondrial genome, and there was one particular unusual substitution. Now, I could be wrong about this affinity to Gigantopithecus and this being just a great ape. Even if it is a great ape, we know that the great apes have a tremendous similarity and affinity to humans.
When did the land bridge? When did the land bridge go out in the Bering Strait?
Well, it's risen and fallen, or the sea level has risen and fallen a number of times, starting clear back in the Miocene and on through the Pleistocene. One of the most recent times, which was
so the great ape.
Well,
that being so, there could have been whatever without having to swim the Pacific. But another question. Have you heard any more on any of were there any gene markers established on the Kennewick man and any bone structures there? That I understand that before the Native Americans reacquired the bones for burial, that there was a physical examination, and I didn't know if there was anything that they could get a gene marker from. Apparently they radiocarboned the thing, and I wonder if you could fill us in on that.
Well, I don't have a lot of information at the tip of my fingers. I do know, I'm not sure if they did conduct any DNA analysis of that specimen, but I do know that, as you said, a careful examination was made, and it was clearly a Paleo-Indian, and probably predated, or did definitely predate any of the native tribes that now occupy that region of the Pacific Northwest.
But there were not any specific Asiatic gene markers, or as far as you know, maybe perhaps there was not any DNA sample sufficient for DNA analysis, but
right,
I
not
thought
aware.
the Native Americans were pretty.
I'll give you a
pretty
clue,
hot to get
Bob.
that skeleton back. Yes.
I'll come at this from a political angle, and then we'll leave Kennewick Man alone because it's great fodder for radio. Don't get me wrong, but it's a little bit off of our path here today. But take a look at how the Army Corps of Engineers, on a virtual war footing, transported Phil by helicopter to bury that site, and the panic that everybody else associated with trying to suppress that data set went about that. I think what you're dealing with there is a Caucasoid. We'll have to look into that more and get someone perhaps to talk about it who specializes in it, but Ancient American has some great articles on that. We're coming up to our break again, Dr. Meldrum. That's good for both of us, I suppose, because we get to wet our whistle a little bit and sort of count the ammunition a little bit, see where we want to go. I have a couple of questions. I'm not going to let the hour go by without asking. And we've got one line open, 254-5855. So there is a chance for you to ask your question, too. Give it a shot.
Barbara Jean on K-Talk.
This is one of those programs that I wish we could prolongate, but we have maybe 35 minutes left or so. That gives your big mouth host here, your my cog, Dale Williams, an opportunity to dominate the conversation and ask a couple questions. And I'm going to do that because I'm not going to let these questions pass. But for now, we have priority on callers. And Dr. Meldrum, at any point, if you have something you want to interject that is that you think is vital to within the scope of the conversation, we should not miss. That feel free to chime in and initiate anything you'd like to talk about. Daryl, it looks like, in Salt Lake City. Daryl, fire away.
Hi, Dale. Professor Meldrum, this is Daryl Smith. I was one of the speakers at the Bigfoot conference last year. Shared a table with you for a while. It's that big map.
Yep, I remember.
Dale, okay, I've been studying Bigfoot, tracking Bigfoot for 25 years, and I have 8 friends who are very much involved in the same thing. Keeps us in the mountains a lot, and we do spend a lot of time up there. In fact, I'm going to be up there today, where we videotaped one a year ago. Anyway, with my own eyes, I've seen tracks and multiple tracks in 13 different places. My friends have, if you count all of us together, we've seen tracks in 29 different places in the last, say, 20 years.
And Dr.
And my
Meldrum,
friends have seen them.
Let me just interject, pardon my interruption, Daryl, but just so folks know, the pickings are pretty good here in northern Utah.
They're excellent.
Aren't they?
I can't believe. I can't believe. I have three of them in my video camera right now.
I mean, in terms of reports coming out, you hear a pretty consistent stream, don't you, Dr. Meldrum?
Right. The history of reports out of the backside of the Wasatch and throughout the Uinta Mountains of northeastern, and even down in the Four Corners area of southern Utah, surprisingly, there's a lot of, on the Colorado Plateau, there's a lot of forested land that is very rich habitat and continues to generate reports of incidents, yes.
Well, Dale, my 8 friends and myself, half of us have seen Bigfoot in person, sometimes more than one at a time. Well, the sighters are always seeing them more than one time. As a matter of fact, 8 days ago, my friend Ryan, a different Ryan, Jeff, than you know, he and his girlfriend 8 days ago watched one for several minutes in their night vision when the BFRO, that's Bigfoot Research Organization, came here from out of state. There's about 40 of them after going through the woods. Anyway, my friend Ryan and his girlfriend watched one in their night vision. The Bigfoot was just watching the campers. You know, they were sitting around the campfire talking, and they had a lot of lights and so on. Well, they were back in the woods, and with their night vision, they watched the Bigfoot right on the edge of their camp, watching them stand behind the tree.
Oh my, Dr. Meldrum, the curiosity is always curiosity is always companion to intelligence, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's probably this tug of war going on between avoiding human contact, but yet being fascinated by our activity and our contrivances and so forth.
Well, Dale, I've had one, of course, with another witness, go around my camp for 5 solid hours up in the Uintas, a place called Gold Hill off the Mirror Lake Highway. We're sitting around a campfire 10 o'clock at night, and there's one going around our camp about every 30 seconds, breaking sticks, trying to scare us for 5 solid hours till 3 o'clock in the morning.
And they can break some big sticks.
They do.
What would a weight of as best you can guess, and knowing what you do about depression, footprints, and what have you, Dr. Meldrum, big male version of one of these critters, what would you estimate the weight to be?
Well, as you said, a large male between 7.5, 8.5 feet tall would probably weigh anywhere from 800 to 1,000 pounds, I would guess.
Oh, let me catch my breath. I've been telling people 500 or 600, but you know, some of these big basketball players and NFL linemen are pushing 350 and what have you. So they would be twice as large and up.
No doubt.
And that's what's deceiving is the mass increases to the cube of linear dimension.
Yes.
So for each foot taller, it's basically 3 cubic feet of volume thereabouts.
Not unlike the mass or the volume of a cylindrical object.
Right.
They calculate naval shells and that sort of thing go up very much with just a little bit of diameter. Daryl, have you had any rock throwing incidents? That's usually a classic experience.
Well, it is. No, I haven't myself, but we've talked to people that have, quite a few. Another thing they do too is if you're walking down their trail through their part of the woods, many times they'll uproot a tree, like a 30-foot tree, to put it across the trail. I videotaped a place too where they've made up a kind of a fence with about 5 trees, and my friends have seen it too down the Tusher Mountains down south of Richfield. As far as the depth of tracks, I videotaped some tracks, my friend and I, up Big Cottonwood Canyon just February, and is on a groomed cross-country trail where the snow was just packed like ice. I mean, we on snowshoes didn't even make an impression at all in it, except we were following tracks on the trail. They're about 9 inches deep.
Daryl, that's our cue coming up to move into a commercial break, and then, of course, on to other patient callers waiting. Thanks for your call, and we'll be right back with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. All right, we're getting right back at it at the bottom of the hour here. Again, it's the Mark Maxon Show, yes, but Mark is not here today. I'll be your host today and tomorrow, and there is a possibility, I'm only dangling this in front of you as a little enticement, that the inimitable John Taylor Gatto may be our guest tomorrow. We can only hope. We'll find out hopefully this evening. Anyway, I'll be here to torment you tomorrow. Right now, though, another heavyweight, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from the state, I keep wanting to mispronounce that. Idaho State University is with us. It's a privilege to have him with us. We have callers lined up. I have to tell you, Dr. Meldrum, our producer came in, Karen, and asked, did Daryl just say Cottonwood, Big Cottonwood Canyon? And that's just east of the habitation here in the valley, just up the canyon a little bit here, and it is exciting and intimidating at the same time that we could have this enormous, obviously very canny, intelligent creature, Mountain Dell Reservoir, just up another canyon just east of Salt Lake City, has been the site of Bigfoot encounters. This being we would have trouble trying to describe its intelligence. It would be like describing the intelligence of a very streetwise, a street smart person that grew up in an urban environment, wouldn't it? I mean, to try to gauge just how in tune with its environment and how well it can disguise itself, things like that. We really don't know what we're dealing with, do we?
Well, I mean, I'm always a little bit loath to imbue extraordinary, capabilities to these animals. They're certainly smarter than the average bear, as Yogi would say, but their intelligence would, in my opinion, is probably on par with that of a great ape. As you said, cougars, for example, are extremely adept at being and remaining elusive. We have a similar situation here in Pocatello. One of our faculty some years ago was conducting a study, and they had radio collared a number of cougars within a 20-mile radius of Pocatello. And yet, if you ask people if there were cougars in our backyard, most would not have any experience upon which to base an opinion. But yet there were 20-some-odd cougars that were tagged and being tracked on a regular basis.
Oh, they're like ghosts.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this animal, given its solitary nature, its nocturnality, its intelligence, it's able to remain elusive and evade our detection.
And Daryl, the caller Daryl, I've met Daryl. We'll have to have a program with you in studio sometime. You obviously have a wealth of experience with that, with this subject, as well as other strange things. And this is a little bit beyond the scope of our conversation, Dr. Meldrum, but this northeast quadrant of Utah is really getting a worldwide reputation as Weirdo Central. Were you aware of all the strange things going on up there?
No, I guess I'm not.
Maybe better that you should stay a little bit ignorant of one of these things. Very, very, very odd aerial phenomena and all sorts of things like that. But for another day. Okay, Richard in Salt Lake City, you're on the air with Dr. Meldrum.
Yeah, great show.
Thank you.
I remember years ago seeing a film that I think got to be very well known, and it was a clip of one of these creatures. And then, if I'm not mistaken, years later, the guy who made the film admitted it was a fraud. And I'm wondering, that's the only film I'm aware of. Are there films out there, and I imagine there are, that have not been, proven fraud?
Back to the Patterson film, undoubtedly.
Well, that probably is where it's stemming, yes. And as I said, those rumors of fraud are grossly exaggerated and premature. If it is indeed the Patterson film,
I think
every one of the claims has not stood up to scrutiny whatsoever. And yet, and in fact, with more attention directed to the film itself, it yields more information, more details as newer technologies are applied to it. So, I mean, there have been hoaxes. I don't want to say that there haven't been hoaxes. There have been a number of ridiculously transparent hoaxes that have been foisted on the public. But the Patterson film, which gets the most mileage because of its remarkable impressiveness.
Richard, I'm sorry, Doug. Richard, if you missed the first hour of the program, who we have on, and I don't mean to embarrass him, but according to all accounts available to me, we have on as a guest today a world authority on locomotor adaptation. We're talking about primates and humans, bipedal locomotion. And Dr. Meldrum, having scrutinized the Patterson film, I'll tell you, it holds up pretty darn well, doesn't it, Dr. Meldrum?
It does, yeah.
Yes.
Well, this is what I heard is that, when the film came out, that it had been subjected to a lot of kinetic study and things like this, and it proved to be very interesting. And then later when I heard that the guy admitted it was a fraud, it took my breath away. I mean, I thought, what's going on here? One other quick question, if I can. Sure. What would be the consequence of somebody shooting one of these? Is it legal, illegal?
Well, there have been some interesting debates and discussions. I think that the bottom line is that while if you hold the feet of the authorities to the fire, they will not obviously acknowledge the existence, but they will eventually acknowledge that if there is no stated season for a form of wildlife, and it is protected. So I think that there would certainly be repercussions, and there would be adjudications to determine what the outcome of those of that circumstance would end up being.
Thank you, Richard. Dr. Meldrum, a couple of questions off air. When you go into the field, is your party armed? And what have you seen personally?
If the circumstances dictate it, we are armed just for personal security in terms of if we're in grizzly country or areas that have had recent cougar activity that's been, incidents of cougar attacks. But no, our policy is obviously not to shoot or try to collect one by lethal means. Our principal goal in the field is to collect DNA evidence, and so we've been utilizing modified wildlife techniques that have approved protocols with our university animal welfare committees, and which include veterinarians and scholars and faculty members and so forth. And we always try to cooperate with or make every effort to cooperate with the local agencies, the Fish and Game and the Forest Service, whenever we're conducting field work.
Well, and that might be a good point to come back on, Dr. Meldrum, the second part of my question, which we oddly in this lengthy interview haven't gotten to yet. What have you seen with your own eyes? An interesting point to start. When we come back, just a short break here, and we'll get to Martin, who's holding on Salt Lake Line, and your calls, which there is time to process here and get on the air. 254-5855.
The afternoons 5 to 7 on K-Talk.
Okay, no time to wait. 1:40 and about 12 seconds past the hour. Boy, those seconds are important. We're going to get right back to Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from Idaho State University. Anything outstanding in terms of your personal eyewitness experience, Dr. Meldrum, you'd like to share with us this afternoon?
Well, I haven't had any eyewitness visual encounters myself, I have to say, and look forward to the time that I might.
What about auditory?
I have heard a couple of vocalizations that I could not put a finger on, identify, but I don't claim any expertise in that area, so that's a very qualified experience. I have seen footprints, though, on at least 5 different occasions, and some extremely clear and distinct. I mean, where there's very little room for interpretation, and so that's one of the most interesting experiences I've had.
I have to ask you. This is, I guess, a fairly personal question. And when you're say deep into the forests in the Northwest and where folks study these things, maybe Idaho, and you're looking at a print as a person who knows what they're looking at as well as anyone on the face of the earth, and the authenticity of that footprint is something that you would be called on to establish by just about anybody. But in this instance, it's you looking down at the footprint, and maybe it's the evening, and night is going to fall. What goes through your mind knowing that you're going to still be in that area when darkness falls, and that this creature is 800 or 900 pounds and
right.
stealthy as all get out when he wants to be?
Well, some people might take exception to this point of view, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that these creatures, these beings, pose any threat to me personally when I'm in the field. All of the accounts typically, there are instances of bluffing behavior and so forth, but all we have are a few anecdotes that suggest any antagonistic behavior directed specifically at humans, and in those rare instances, without exception, the human initiated it by shooting at the individual or one of its cohort. And so I've gotten to the point where, and sometimes I have to remind myself of this, but when I'm in the field, you intellectualize why are you there? At some point when you start thinking you see something behind every tree, and that begins to make you rather anxious, I just remind myself, well, hey, I hope there is something behind every tree. I sure would like to see one, and so that takes the edge off it. But I'm not concerned. I'm not overly. I was once asked by one of my colleagues, what would I do? You know, he was being very facetious and actually very antagonistic. But he said, well, what would you do if the Sasquatch chased you down and, you know, did you physical harm? And I said, well, I certainly would have a lot more luck getting a grant next time. He didn't find that very humorous.
Well, and if we get time, we're going to visit that subject of the reaction of your peers to this remarkable book that you've produced. But we have Martin, who's been waiting very patiently. Martin, are you still with us?
Yes.
A question.
Well, I actually have had an experience where I've seen, at least I assume it was a Sasquatch or something of that nature. And this was in 84, 85, and I was on my way up to Jackson, Wyoming. I took the Yellowstone route, and this was about 3 in the morning. I was just speeding through Yellowstone, and I just got a funny feeling, and it was a very strong feeling. I slowed down, and as I was driving by, I saw a red pair of eyes to my left. I stopped, backed up because I had to see what it was. It happened to be a moose. And I was thinking, oh, well, that's weird. It's just a moose. But as I was stopped, I saw something in my rearview mirror, and something was walking upright. This is 3 in the morning, just in June, or excuse me, early, the end of May, actually, the end of May. So, you know, there's hardly anybody up there at that time. Something was walking upright. It wasn't heavy. It was kind of a thin build in a way, but looked very strong.
In your rearview mirror?
In my rearview, well, actually I saw him in my right mirror, and then I saw him, you know, in my rearview mirror, and then, you know, walking across and saw him in my other mirror, and it was only 10 feet behind me. Now it wasn't even looking at me. It was walking over towards that, it looked to me like it was walking towards that moose. But it didn't pay me any mind. I mean, I had my lights on, my engine running, and it could care less that I was there. And of course, you know, I'm seeing this thing. It was probably only about 7 feet high, I think. Which
7 feet goes a long way in the middle of the night, though, doesn't it, Martin?
Well, yeah. And and the thing is, it was so funny. I'm looking at this, and now obviously I'm not getting the best view of it because I'm not seeing it directly, because I'm looking in my mirrors, seeing it, but it just didn't. It could have cared less if I was there or not, and that was a weird thing. That because I was thinking, well, these things would hide, but it didn't even care.
Is that a typical sort of posture that people observe, Dr. Meldrum? This sort of like, you know, bull moose exhibit this. They look over at you. You might as well be a beetle or a dragonfly. They don't give a darn about what you're doing. You ever hear about that kind of indifference?
Well, a certain degree of nonchalance, I think, and it would depend on the circumstances and the perceived threat. The vehicle itself is probably not perceived so much as a threat as if he had stepped out and was standing there, and then he might be brandishing a gun or whatever. People on horseback often, you know, and this is true with other forms of wildlife as well. You can ride into a herd of wild elk on horseback, and they won't even give you any notice. But if you dismount, suddenly now you're a threat, and they'll disperse. And I've had eyewitnesses talk about coming up very close to a Sasquatch before it really seemed to pay much notice to them because they were on horseback. So that might have been the circumstance that elicited that nonchalant attitude.
Anything else, Martin?
Well, I was the one that got out of there pretty quick, not it.
All right, thanks for your call.
Okay, thanks.
Another question off air, Dr. Meldrum. Let's see. We're just checking our clock here. I think we've got about 2 minutes till our break, and then we'll have our last segment. But an individual is interested to know about any evidence of family organization and the behavior within that family. I think that's probably a bit of a stretch. Do you care to go there?
Well, we can only infer some speculation based on the data at hand, and by far the majority of the footprints that have been found and the majority of the eyewitness accounts have been of solitary individuals. When multiple individuals are found, more often than not, it's a relatively smaller footprint of, you know, a 13, 14, 15-inch range in the company of what appear to be juveniles or infant offspring. My colleague John Meinzinski, for example, witnessed a line of tracks with about a 14.5-inch track that was accompanied by a little track that was only about 4.5, 5 inches in length. And the little tracks were meandering about as a young animal or individual would, seeming to apparently exploring its environment, and every once in a while it would converge on the tracks of its presumed parent and disappear, obviously being picked up and carried for some distance. So I think, the temptation is to draw parallels to something like an orangutan, where you have an alpha male, a dominant male that defends its home territory, which overlaps that of several females with offspring. And that seems to be a reasonable model based on a number of bits and pieces of evidence strung together. But again, we can only speculate on those types of aspects of their natural history at this point, if at all.
Just a few seconds to our break. When investigators come across these kinds of tracks, is that typically in deep woods? Do you have to get really into the middle of the big north woods to see these things typically?
Well, tracks have been found in extremely remote areas, and they've also been found at construction sites or in rural, in farmlands and so forth. It just kind of depends. It's all an issue of intersection.
There's our break, Doctor, and we'll be right back with our final segment with Dr. Meldrum from the Idaho State University. Okay, it looks like 4 or 5 minutes left with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. How the time has flown. Dr. Meldrum, I've been remiss, actually, in the rest of the program in not allowing you to give any contact data that you might want to get out to our audience, and also explain how we can get your book, if you would.
Well, the book is available at all Barnes & Nobles and Borders, and also on Amazon.com. The paperback will be coming out in about a month from now, sometime in September.
How have sales been, by the way?
They've been very, very good, considering the type of book and the fact that it's a hardback that is a little bit not pricey, but as hardbacks go, it's as it would be expected. But it has been very well received and received very positive reviews for the most part, with a few exceptions from some hardcore skeptics. At one point I would like to make, too, is, as we go through, especially over a 2-hour period with these types of discussions, I tend to fall out of the habit of qualifying each of my statements with alleged, purported, if, and so forth. I do want to make a point that the book is not intended to convince people of the existence of Sasquatch. The book is intended to lay out a baseline of information that we know and don't know, and what we don't know, what we're lacking to resolve this question. But I think its primary objective is to demonstrate that there is much more to this than most people have realized, and that it fully warrants our serious attention as academics, as anthropologists, as wildlife biologists, and so forth. Dr. Schaller, very, very articulately expressed that sentiment in the foreword to the book. So I'm not proselytizing the existence of Sasquatch, and I recognize the need for a type specimen. I recognize the methodologies of science and so forth. But with that recognition also comes a big dose of the spirit of exploration in the light of the very compelling and intriguing evidence that continues to persist and to come to the fore.
Well, that's I'm reminded of Dr. Mack, who wrote Abducted, and maybe we shouldn't mix our subjects here, but this is a really top-notch academic. I want to say Yale or Harvard. I think it was Harvard, a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. But anyway, there is an occasion where it's an established academic, which you were, unimpeachable bona fides and all the rest of it, and then you depart and you go out from the umbrella, from under the umbrella of acceptability and safety and what have you, and do something like this. It's important to point out, as you are, that this thing is not some kind of attempt to sell books or sensationalism, whatever. It's just it's really groundbreaking. You're making the ground safe for other people. That's what I admire about you. And yeah, there have been other people who have contributed to that, but you've made the biggest splash so far. We have about 2 minutes left, Dr. Meldrum. Is there anything you want to say about that's an awful short period of time, but about the reaction of your peers, good or bad, to this book?
Well, in short, it has spanned the entire gambit. There was an Associated Press article that was that painted a much more dire picture than actually exists here on campus, as if I was an outcast and lurked in my dark laboratory and was shunned by faculty and students alike. And that was, I think, an ambitious young reporter just trying to get an article on the wire services. It was greatly exaggerated. But there are individuals who take exception. But I tell you, as a result of that publicity, which went international, the outpouring of expressions of support from all quarters, and I mean, I received thousands of emails, and of those, literally 2 were negative. All the rest, and some from academics, some from various disciplines, expressing their support, and whether they had an opinion about Sasquatch or not, expressing support for academic freedom and the right to pursue this question in a responsible, objective manner, which I'm attempting to do.
And
so that was very gratifying.
Jane Goodall has been supportive of you then.
Absolutely. And I had the good pleasure of actually meeting her and shaking her hand and visiting with her briefly when she made an appearance at Humboldt State University when I was doing some research in Northern California. And once again, she reiterated her enthusiasm and interest in this subject and her strong support for the effort, and that was very gratifying. Yeah.
In our last 20 seconds or so, if someone wants to reach you, what would you suggest?
Well, email would probably be the best way, and the email to reach me at is simply jeff.meldrum@gmail.com. And I try to be attentive to those. Sometimes I get a little overwhelmed, but do my best.
Well, will you come back and visit with us again, Dr. Meldrum?
I'd be happy to.
We've certainly enjoyed this. It's been a thrill, and thanks for coming in on really 12 hours notice.
You bet. My pleasure.
Take care. Okay, folks, stay tuned to K-Talk. Live programming coming your way in not too long, and I'll be back to see you tomorrow. Let's hope we have John Keller Gatto with us.
Barbara Jean on K-Talk. AM 630 KTKK.